The rain came down like it had a grudge against the whole town, and 17-year-old Della Brennan stood under the rusted overhang of the shuttered hardware store on Coverdale's main street, watching the gutters overflow and wondering how a person could be this wet and still alive. It was the second week of November, the kind of cold that crawled up through the soles of your shoes and settled into the marrow, and her last $41 had gone 3 days ago to a motel that wouldn't take her back without another night's payment. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She had no coat worth the name, just a hooded sweatshirt gone gray from too many washings in gas station bathrooms, and a backpack that held everything she owned in the world. 2 changes of clothes, a paperback with the cover torn off, a photograph of her mother she'd laminated at a library copy machine for 40 cents, and a flashlight that worked if you smacked it. Lightning split the sky over the hills to the east, and in that white flash she saw the whole length of the empty street, the boarded windows, the dead traffic lights swinging on its wire, and she understood with a flat, exhausted certainty that no one was coming to help her tonight. No one had come to help her in a long time. She hadn't always been the girl shivering under an awning. There had been a house once, small and crooked but warm, on a street where the neighbors knew her name. Her mother, Linny Brennan, had worked the early shift at a packing plant 40 minutes away and the late shift at a diner on the weekends, and somewhere in between she had raised Della mostly alone, with a fierce, tired tenderness that Della understood only now that it was gone. Linny had a way of making nothing feel like enough. A can of soup split between 2 bowls became an occasion if she lit a candle. A second-hand coat became a treasure if she said the right words over it. She used to tell Della that the world was full of people who would look right through her, and that the only thing that mattered was learning to look back without flinching. Della had not understood what that meant when she was 9. She understood it completely at 17, standing in the rain in a town that had no use for her. The cancer took her mother in 14 months, and it took everything else along the way. It started as a cough that wouldn't quit and a tiredness Linny blamed on the double shifts, and by the time anyone took it seriously, it had already gone everywhere it was going to go. Della had spent those 14 months learning things a 15-year-old shouldn't have to learn: how to read a hospital bill, how to argue with a collections agent, how to hold a basin and how to hold a hand, and how to sit in a waiting room pretending to do homework while her whole world thinned out in a bed down the hall. The house went first, sold to cover what the insurance wouldn't, then the car, then the small things that had made the rented apartment feel like theirs: the good pots, her mother's sewing machine, the little television. There was no father in the picture, never had been, just a name Della had heard maybe 3 times and a man her mother said wasn't worth the breath it took to discuss. There were no grandparents who could be found. There was only a great aunt in another state who sent a sympathy card and a $50 bill and a note that said, "Let me know if you need anything, dear," and then never answered the phone again, the way people do when they're afraid the answer to "what do you need" might be everything. Della had spent 2 months after the funeral in a group placement that felt like a waiting room for a train that never came, a converted house with too many girls and not enough of anything, where your shoes walked off in the night and your grief was just one more thing nobody had room for. She wasn't mistreated, exactly. She was simply stored, the way you store a box you mean to deal with later and never do. And on the cold, bright morning after her 17th birthday, which no one had mentioned, she had packed her backpack and walked out the front door while everyone was at breakfast and never gone back. She wasn't running toward anything. She had no plan and no destination and no illusions. She was just done being stored, done being a problem on someone else's list, done waiting in a room for a future that was never going to be delivered. She had drifted from town to town since spring, picking up cash work where she could, washing dishes for a week here, stocking shelves under the table there, walking dogs and pulling weeds and cleaning out a hoarder's garage for $60 and a sandwich, sleeping in shelters when there was room and in stairwells and bus station chairs and the occasional unlocked church when there wasn't. She had gotten good at being invisible, at taking up no space, at the small economies of the very poor. Coverdale was the latest stop, chosen for no better reason than that the highway exit had a sign with a town name on it, and the trucker who'd given her a lift was getting off there, and she'd had nowhere better to be. The town had not welcomed her. There was a diner where she'd spent $1.20 on coffee and stretched it across 2 hours until the waitress started giving her the look that meant move along. There was a church with a soup kitchen that operated on Tuesdays, but it was Thursday. There was a man at the gas station who'd offered her a ride somewhere with a smile that made her skin crawl, and she'd said no thank you and walked the other way until she was sure he wasn't following. And there was the rain, which had started as a drizzle around 4 o'clock and become this, a hammering downpour that turned the streets to black mirrors and drove the temperature down by the hour. Her phone had died at noon, and she had no way to charge it. She had no place to be and no place to go, and the night was getting colder, and somewhere in the back of her mind a small voice that sounded like her mother said, "Move. Baby, you can't stay still and cold like this. You'll go to sleep and not wake up." So she moved. She pulled the hood tight around her face and stepped out from under the awning into the full force of it, and the rain hit her like a wall. Within seconds, she was soaked through to the skin, the cold so sharp it stole her breath. She put her head down and walked, not toward anything, just away from the dead center of town, following the slope of the land downhill the way water follows it, because downhill felt easier and because she had no reason to choose any direction over another. The sidewalks gave out after a few blocks and became gravel shoulders, and the streetlights grew farther apart and then stopped altogether, and she found herself walking along a county road with dark fields on either side, the kind of road that went somewhere eventually, but not soon. She thought about turning back. There was nothing to turn back to. She kept walking. It was the lightning that showed her the barn. She had been walking for what felt like an hour, though it might have been less, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached, when the sky lit up again and she saw it standing back from the road across a flooded field. A big old barn, the kind they didn't build anymore, with a steep gambrel roof and weathered siding that had gone the silver gray of bones left out in the weather. It sat at the end of a long dirt track that had turned to soup, beside the dark shape of a farmhouse that looked, even at a distance, even in a half-second of lightning, like nobody had lived in it for years. There were no lights. There were no cars. There was a sagging mailbox at the head of the track with its little flag rusted down, and a sign she couldn't read, and a chain across the entrance that had long since fallen into the mud. The whole place had the look of something the world had forgotten on its way to somewhere else. Della stood at the head of that track for a long moment, the rain running off her nose and chin, and she did the arithmetic that homelessness teaches you to do without thinking. An empty barn was shelter. An empty barn was out of the wind and the rain. An empty barn was, technically and legally, breaking and entering, and she had spent her whole life being the kind of person who didn't break rules, who said please and thank you, who returned the extra change when a cashier made a mistake, because her mother had raised her to believe that being poor was no excuse for being less than honest. But her mother had also raised her to survive, and there was a hard line in Linny Brennan's gentleness, a place where she would have said, between this and freezing, you choose living, and you don't apologize for it. Della pulled her dead phone out of her pocket out of habit, looked at the black screen, put it back. Then she stepped off the road and started across the field toward the barn. The field was worse than the road. The earth had turned to a sucking clay that pulled at her shoes with every step, and twice she nearly went down on her hands and knees, catching herself at the last second. The flooded furrows soaked her to the knee. By the time she reached the barn, she was shaking violently, her hands so numb she couldn't feel her own fingers, and she had stopped thinking about anything except the door. The big main doors were chained and padlocked, the chain new enough to still be bright where everything else had rusted, which was strange, but she didn't have the strength to wonder about it. She worked her way along the side of the building, dragging one hand against the rough, wet wood, until she came to a smaller door near the back corner, a person-sized door that had once been painted red and was now mostly bare. It had a hasp and a padlock too, but the wood around the hasp had rotted soft, and when she put her shoulder against the door and pushed with what little she had left, the screws tore out of the wood with a sound like a sigh, and the door swung inward, and she fell through it onto a floor of old straw and dust, and out of the rain at last. For a while she just lay there. The relief of being out of the wind was so total that it felt like warmth, though it wasn't, not really. The roar of the rain on the roof high above was deafening, but it was a different sound than the rain hitting her own body, an outside sound now instead of an inside one. and she lay on the straw with her cheek against the gritty floorboards and let her breath slow down and her heart stop trying to climb out of her chest. Her whole body had begun to shake in long, uncontrollable waves, and she knew enough to be afraid of that. Knew that the shaking was the body's last alarm bell before the cold started shutting things down. But she also knew the shaking meant she was still fighting, still warm enough inside to try. And she lay there and let her body do its desperate work and didn't fight it. The dark inside the barn was nearly absolute. She could smell old hay and motor oil and the deep mineral cold of a building that hadn't been heated in years, and under all of it something faintly sweet and rotten, the smell of small things that had died in the walls and never been found. Water dripped somewhere far off in the dark, a slow, patient ticking. When she finally pushed herself up to sitting, her elbows screaming, her whole body protesting the movement like an old woman's, she fumbled the flashlight out of her backpack with fingers she could barely command and smacked it twice against her palm until the weak yellow beams stuttered reluctantly to life. The barn was enormous inside, far bigger than it had looked from the road, the ceiling lost in shadow above her, the great dark beams crossing overhead like the ribs of a whale. The flashlight beam was a small thing in all that space. She swept it slowly around. There were stalls along one wall, empty, their gates hanging open. There was an ancient tractor in the middle of the floor, its tires flat and cracked, draped in a tarp gone stiff with age and furred with dust. There was a workbench against the far wall with tools still hanging on a pegboard above it, wrenches and saws and things she didn't have names for, all of them red with rust. There was a loft above the stalls, reachable by a ladder bolted to the wall, and the dark suggestion of more space up there. And there was, everywhere, the sediment of abandonment, the cobwebs thick as cloth in the corners, the bird droppings, the drifts of dead leaves that had blown in through gaps in the siding over the course of many autumns. Nobody had been in here in a long time. Whoever had put the bright new chain on the front doors had not come inside. Della got herself up off the floor, swaying a little, and went to work on the only problem that mattered, which was the cold. She was shaking so hard now that her vision jittered with it, and she knew, in the practical animal part of her brain that had kept her alive this far, that wet clothes in this temperature would kill her before morning if she let them. She found a relatively clean patch of floor near the old tractor, sheltered from the worst of the draft, and she stripped off her soaked sweatshirt and the soaked shirt underneath and wrung them out until the water ran in a stream onto the floor. From her backpack, she pulled her one dry change of clothes, sealed in a plastic grocery bag against exactly this kind of disaster, and she dressed in them with her back to the wall and her teeth chattering. And then she pulled the wet things back over the dry ones for the extra layer, because warmth was warmth. She found the stiff old tarp on the tractor and wrestled a corner of it free, and though it stank and crackled and shed dust, it was something between her and the air, and she wrapped herself in it and sat down with her back against the tractor's huge rear tire and pulled her knees to her chest. The shaking didn't stop, but it slowed. She sat in the dark and the noise and listened to the rain, which seemed if anything to be getting harder, drumming on the roof in great rolling sheets. And she thought about her mother, the way she did when things were bad, because the memory of being loved was the only blanket she had that never wore out. She thought about the candle Linny used to light at the table on the nights when there wasn't enough, the little flame turning a bowl of plain rice into something that felt chosen instead of forced, her mother's face soft and gold in the light of it, saying, "See, baby, we're having dinner by candlelight, like rich people." She thought about the way her mother would put her cold feet against Della's legs on winter nights in the old house and laugh when Della yelped and squirmed away, and how Della would give anything in the entire world, to be cold like that again, to be a child complaining about her mother's icy feet in a warm bed in a warm house with the certainty that morning would come and her mother would still be there. She thought about Linny's hands, rough from the plant and the diner, and the way they had still been gentle, always gentle, even at the very end when there was almost nothing left of her but the gentleness. She put her face against her knees and let herself cry for a little while, quietly, the way you learn to cry when you live among strangers and tears are a thing that can be used against you, just a hot leaking that she let happen and didn't make a sound over. And then she stopped, deliberately, the way she taught herself to stop, because crying didn't keep you warm and morning was a long way off, and there was no one coming to comfort her, and the only person who could get Della to morning was Della. She wiped her face on the dry sleeve and breathed until her chest stopped hitching. She had to make it to morning. She always had to make it to morning. That was the only job she had left, and she had never once failed at it. Not in 8 months of cold and hunger and fear, and she wasn't going to fail at it tonight in a stranger's barn with the rain coming down like the end of the world. She must have slept, or something like sleep, a thin gray drifting full of cold dreams, because the next thing she knew the quality of the dark had changed. The rain had stopped. The silence of its stopping was what had woken her, that sudden absence of the roar. She'd fallen asleep inside. Her flashlight had died at some point, the beam guttering out, and the barn was utterly black except for the faintest gray seam of pre-dawn light bleeding in around the door she'd broken through. Her body had stiffened into a single aching knot. She didn't know what time it was. She lay still for a long moment, getting her bearings, and that was when she heard the sound. It came from below her, from under the floor. It was a small sound, a sound she might have dismissed as the building settling or a rat in the walls if it had come only once, but it came again, and then again, a slow rhythmic creaking, like the strain of old rope under a slowly increasing weight, or the flex of a board taking pressure and letting it go. Creak. Pause. Creak. It had a deliberateness to it that the random noises of an old building did not have. Della's whole body went rigid under the tarp, every sense suddenly screaming, the animal in her wide awake. She held her breath and listened. The sound was directly beneath her, somewhere below the floorboard she was sitting on, and as she listened she became aware of a faint movement of air against her face, a cold draft that came up through the floor itself, smelling of earth and damp stone, and that deep, ancient cold of underground places. There was a cellar under the barn, and something in the cellar was moving. For one long, terrible moment Della was certain that the man from the gas station had followed her, that she'd led him here, that he was down there in the dark beneath her waiting. The thought was so vivid and so awful that she nearly cried out. But reason caught up a half-second later. There was no way down that she had seen. The sound was not footsteps. It was slow and mechanical, almost patient, and the more she listened the more she became sure it wasn't a person at all, but something the building was doing on its own. The cellar door perhaps, or some old mechanism, moved by the wind or by the shifting of waterlogged earth after the storm. The rational explanation steadied her enough to move. She freed herself from the tarp and crawled, on her hands and knees, in the direction of the sound, feeling ahead of herself across the floorboards with numb fingers. The boards changed under her hands. Where the rest of the floor was wide, rough planks laid close, here was a section, maybe 4 feet by 4 feet, of newer wood, the boards narrower and fitted together with a care that the rest of the barn didn't show. She had crawled right past it in the dark the night before without knowing it was there. She ran her fingers along the seams. There was an iron ring set flush into one of the boards, the kind of ring you'd grip to lift a hatch, and the whole square section was a trapdoor, and it was this trapdoor that was making the sound, flexing very slightly up and down as the draft from the cellar pushed against it and let it fall. Della knelt over it, her heart pounding, the gray dawn light just barely enough now to make out shapes. She should leave it alone. Every sensible instinct she had told her to leave it alone, to wait for full light, to get out of this barn before whoever owned it came to check on their bright new chain. But she had spent the whole night being acted upon by the world, blown around by cold and rain and bad luck like a leaf in a gutter, and something in her, some last unbroken thing, wanted to be the one who decided. Wanted to know. She hooked 2 fingers through the iron ring and pulled. The trapdoor was heavier than it looked, and stuck, swollen with the night's damp. But she set her feet and hauled with both hands and her back, and with a long groan it came up and over, and fell open against the floorboards with a boom that echoed up into the rafters and sent something winged flapping in the loft above her. Cold air poured up out of the opening, rich with the smell of earth and stone and standing water, and underneath it all something else, something faintly metallic and dry, a smell she didn't have a name for yet. Below the trapdoor was a hole, and set into the side of the hole was a ladder, an old wooden ladder bolted to a wall of fitted fieldstone, descending into a darkness her eyes couldn't penetrate. The cellar was deep, deeper than a root cellar had any business being. She lay on her stomach at the edge and looked down and could see nothing but the first few rungs of the ladder and then black. She smacked the dead flashlight against her palm and, miraculously, it coughed out a few seconds of light, enough to show her the ladder going down maybe 10 or 12 feet to a stone floor and the hint of a room down there, larger than the opening suggested. Then the light died for good. Della sat back on her heels and made herself think. She was a 17-year-old girl alone in a stranger's barn at dawn, about to climb down a ladder into a black hole in the ground, which was, she was fully aware, exactly the kind of thing that got girls like her killed in the stories. But the cellar was warmer than the barn. She could feel it. The air coming up was cold, but it was a still cold, a sheltered cold, with none of the killing draft that moved through the gaps in the barn siding. Down there she would be out of the wind completely. Down there, she could maybe sleep until the sun was properly up, and she could see what she was doing and figure out her next move. And there was the other thing, the thing she didn't quite admit to herself, which was that the not knowing had its hooks in her now, and she had to see. She turned around and put her feet on the ladder and went down into the dark. The rungs were cold and slick under her hands, and she went slowly, testing each one before she trusted it her weight, counting them under her breath the way her mother had taught her to count things when she was scared. 1, 2, 3, the numbers a thread back up to the gray square of light above. The ladder held. At the bottom her shoes touched stone, gritty and dry, and she stood for a moment in the pitch black with her back against the ladder, breathing, letting her eyes do what they could. Above her the open trapdoor was a faint gray rectangle. Down here there was no light at all. But there was, she realized, a sound, a small steady drip of water somewhere off to her left. And the cellar had an echo to it, the particular flat resonance of a stone room of a certain size. And as she stood there her eyes began, very slowly, to find the faint scraps of light that filtered down from above and resolved the dark into the suggestion of shapes. The room was big, bigger than the trapdoor, bigger maybe than the footprint of the barn above it. A long, low stone chamber that stretched away from her into deeper dark. And the walls were not bare. She edged forward with her hands out in front of her, sliding her feet so as not to trip, and her fingers met a wall of stacked wooden crates. They were old, the wood gone soft and splintery at the edges, stacked in a long row against the cellar wall, and stenciled on the side of the nearest one in faded paint were letters and numbers she couldn't read in the dark. She felt along the top of the stack. The crates were nailed shut, the lids fitted tight, and when she pressed her palm flat against one and pushed, it didn't shift at all, heavy as a coffin, heavy as if it were packed with stone. There were canvas tarps thrown over some of them, stiff with age and gritty with dust, and beneath the tarps the crates had a different feel, smaller, and there were straps around them, leather or canvas straps with metal buckles that her fingers traced in the dark and couldn't make sense of. She moved on, deeper into the room, one hand always on the cold stone wall to keep her bearings, and her other hand found a long heavy shape that turned out to be a wooden shelf, a workbench really, bolted into the stone, and on the shelf, rows of objects, cool and smooth and astonishingly heavy when she lifted one, a small ingot of some metal the size of a candy bar, but weighing what felt like 5 pounds. She turned it over in her numb hands, baffled. She had no way to see what it was. She set it down, carefully, the way you set down something you suspect is worth more than you are, and she felt for another, and it was the same, heavy and dense and cold, and another, dozens of them, maybe more, ranked along the shelf in neat rows like loaves of bread cooling, so many that when she ran her hand down the line of them, she lost count, and her arm got tired before she reached the end of the row. And there was a second row behind the first. And below the shelf, when she crouched and felt into the dark space beneath it, there were more of them stacked directly on the floor, in low square piles, each pile higher than her hand could reach without standing. She straightened up slowly, her heart doing something strange in her chest, and she made herself keep moving because stopping to feel things was a luxury she could not afford in the dark. Her hand met a stack of flat metal boxes, the kind of strong box you'd lock with a key, 6 or 8 of them stacked one on the other, each with a heavy hasp and a keyhole, each weighing more than a box that size had any right to weigh. Beyond the boxes was a row of glass jars on a low ledge, sealed jars, and when she lifted one to her ear and tilted it, she heard the dry, shifting slide of small, hard things inside, like beads, like seeds, like a jar of dried beans, except heavier, much heavier. She set it back exactly where it had been. Beyond the jars were more crates, and what felt like rolled carpets or rolled canvas standing on end in a corner, tall as she was and bound with cord. And the deeper she went into the room, the more there was. The chamber refusing to end, an entire underground vault packed floor to ceiling with the weight and shape of things that had been hidden here, deliberately, by hands that had taken great care, and then left to wait in the dark for years. Della stood very still in the middle of it all, in the absolute dark, holding one of the heavy little ingots she'd picked up again, and a strange feeling moved through her that had nothing to do with the cold. She didn't understand what she had found. She didn't have the light to understand it. But the back of her neck was prickling and her heart was going fast and slow at the same time. And she had the distinct and dizzying sense that she had fallen, by pure accident, by the dumb luck of a broken door and a bad storm, into the middle of something very large and very secret and not at all hers. She thought about the bright new chain on the barn doors. Somebody was keeping this. Somebody was guarding it. And whatever it was worth guarding. She needed light. There was nothing she could learn down here in the dark except that there was a great deal of something, and she needed to know what, and she needed to do it before the sun got high and the day brought whoever it was that hung new chains on old barns. She felt her way back to the ladder, the ingot still clutched in her hand without her quite deciding to keep it, and she climbed back up into the barn, which seemed almost bright now after the cellar, the dawn having advanced while she was below into a thin gray morning that came in through every gap and crack. She knelt by the open trapdoor and looked at the thing in her hand for the first time in real light. It was metal, a dull silvery gray, heavier for its size than anything she'd ever held. It had a roughness to its surface, the texture of something cast in a mold rather than machined, with little pits and ridges along the edges where the molten metal had cooled unevenly. On the top face, worn but legible, was a stamp pressed deep into the surface, a set of numbers and a small mark she didn't recognize, an oval with letters inside it, and below that a word, and below the word a longer string of digits that had the look of a serial number, each digit struck separately and slightly crooked. She turned it to catch the thin light coming in around the door. The word was a maker's mark of some kind, foreign-looking, and the numbers, she would understand much later, were a measure of purity and a unique identifier. The fingerprint of a single object, but in that moment all she knew was that she was holding a bar of metal that weighed like a held breath and had been made by someone who cared enough to brand it with a name. She scratched at the surface with her thumbnail, and the metal didn't mark, didn't flake, didn't show the dull lead gray scuff that cheap metal showed. It was not silver. It didn't have the bright white look of silver or the way silver tarnished black at the edges. It had a faint warmth to its gray, almost a paleness, like something that wanted to be a brighter color and was only hiding. She had seen pictures, everyone had seen pictures, of what this might be, but the pictures were always yellow and gleaming, and this was gray and dull, and she did not let herself think the word that was trying to form in her mind, because the word was too big, and she was too tired and too cold and too used to the world taking things away from her to let herself believe, even for a second, that the world had for once, by some accident it would surely correct, put something like that in her hands. She set the bar down on the floor and looked back into the dark square of the cellar, and she thought, with the flat practicality that had become her whole personality over the last 8 months, I have to come back when I can see. And then, on the heels of that thought, a colder one, and I have to be gone before anyone comes. She did not yet know whose barn this was. She did not know what was down there, or how it had gotten there, or what it was worth. She knew only that she had found it, and that finding it had changed the temperature of her whole life, and that she was, for the first time and longer than she could remember, not thinking about the cold. The light came up while she sat there. Through a gap in the siding, she could see the field she'd crossed in the night, churned and flooded, and beyond it the county road, empty, and beyond that the hills wreathed in the morning's slow mist. The farmhouse stood dark and silent. No car had come up the track. Della made herself eat the last granola bar in the bottom of her backpack, dividing it into small bites and chewing each one slowly the way her mother had taught her to make a little food feel like more. And she drank rainwater that had pooled in the curve of the tarp, and she felt the warmth of the calories spread through her and the worst edge of her exhaustion lift. She would need light to go back down. She had matches somewhere, a book of them she'd picked up at a diner months ago, damp now, but maybe usable. She would need to be careful. She would need to be smart. And above all, she would need, she understood, looking at the heavy gray bar gleaming dully on the dusty floor, to be very, very quiet about whatever this was, because the one thing she had learned in 17 hard years was that the moment the world found out you had something, the world started figuring out how to take it. She wrapped the bar in a sock and put it in the bottom of her backpack, telling herself she would put it back, that she was only borrowing it, only taking it up where she could look at it, and not quite believing herself. Then she closed the trapdoor over the cellar, lowering it gently so it didn't boom this time, and she dragged some straw and a fallen board over the seam so that you'd have to know it was there to find it. She didn't fully understand why she did this. Instinct, maybe. The same instinct that had told her to wring out her clothes and find the tarp. The instinct that said, "This is yours now, the knowing of it is yours, and you protect the things that are yours." She found a place in the loft where she could see the track and the road through a knothole, and she climbed up there with her backpack and the stinking tarp and made a kind of nest in the old hay. And she lay down to wait for the day to warm and her clothes to dry and her mind to clear enough to make a plan. She was asleep in 90 seconds, the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who has been cold all night and is finally, marginally, warm. And while she slept, the morning sun climbed over the eastern hills and threw its light across the flooded field and the silver-gray barn and the dark farmhouse. And somewhere down in the stone cellar beneath her the hidden weight of 30 years of someone's terrible, careful secret sat in the dark, waiting, the way it had waited a long time already, for the day someone like Della Brennan would come along and need a place to get out of the rain. She woke a little after noon to the sound of a vehicle on the road. The fear was instant and total, dropping into her stomach like a swallowed stone. She rolled to the knothole and put her eye to it and watched a pickup truck slow at the head of the track, an old green truck flecked with rust along the wheel wells, and her whole body went still as a hunted animal's. The truck idled there for a long moment, and Della couldn't breathe, couldn't think, certain it was turning in, certain this was the end of her brief, strange morning of secrets. The driver's window came down. A heavy-set arm in a plaid sleeve rested on the door. For a moment she thought he was going to get out, and her mind raced through everything she would have to do: grab the backpack, get to the loft ladder, hide, run, and then the truck didn't turn. It sat with its engine running while the driver, a heavy-set shape behind a rain-spotted windshield, seemed to look up the track toward the buildings, a long, careful, proprietary look, the look of a man taking inventory of something that was his. His head moved slowly from the farmhouse to the barn and back. Then the window came up and the truck pulled away and continued down the road, and she heard the engine fade, and then it was gone. Della let her breath out slowly, a long shaking exhale she hadn't known she was holding. But the relief was thin, because she had seen, in the moment the truck slowed, the way the driver's head had turned, the deliberate, unhurried way he'd looked up the track, the way you look at land you know you own and intend to keep owning. He hadn't looked the way a stranger looks at an abandoned place, with idle curiosity or none at all. He'd looked the way a man looks at a thing he checks on, a thing he worries about, a thing that matters to him. The chain on the doors, the look up the track. Somebody was watching this barn, watching it close, and sooner or later somebody was going to come up that track and walk around the side of the building and find that the little red door at the back corner had its hasp torn out of the rotten wood and was hanging open, and they were going to wonder who had done it, and they were going to look, and the looking was not going to stop at a broken door. She had time, she told herself. Maybe a day, maybe two, maybe only hours. But she had some. And in that time she had to learn what was down there and decide what to do about it. And she had to do it alone, because there was no one in the world she could call, no one who would believe her, no one who wouldn't either dismiss her as a crazy homeless kid or, worse, believe her and want it for themselves. She thought about the soup kitchen and the church and the diner and the gas station man with the crawling smile. She thought about the police, and the thought made her laugh out loud, a short, ugly sound in the empty loft that startled her with how bitter it was. What would she even say? "Officer, I broke into a barn to get out of the rain and found a cellar full of metal bars. Can you help me?" She could see exactly how it would go, could see the way the officer's face would close, the way his eyes would move over her dirty clothes and her stuffed backpack and her chapped hands, the way the questions would turn from the barn to her. "Where are you from? Where are your parents? How long have you been on your own? Do you have any ID?" And the next thing she knew, she'd be back in a placement, back in a waiting room for a train that never came. And the cellar and everything in it would belong to the man in the green truck, and Della Brennan would be nothing again, less than nothing, a name in a file. She'd seen how the world looked at a girl with everything she owned on her back. She'd be the suspect before she finished her first sentence. She'd be the thief, or the liar, or the crazy one. Never the finder. Never the one it might belong to. No, whatever this was, she was going to have to be smarter about it than that. She lay back in the hay and stared up at the dark beams crossing the ceiling and made herself breathe slowly and think, really think, the way her mother used to make her think through a problem instead of just feeling her way through it. "Don't borrow the whole mountain," Linny used to say. "Take the one stone you can carry and then come back for the next." Step one was light. She needed to get back down into that cellar with enough light to see all of it, to understand the true scale of what was there, because she still didn't. Not really. She only knew it was a great deal of something heavy. Step two was knowledge. She needed to figure out what the metal was, and whose it was, and why on earth it was hidden in a stone room under an abandoned barn at the end of a flooded track in a town that didn't even have a working traffic light. And step three, the one she couldn't see clearly yet, the one that loomed up ahead of her in the dark like the open mouth of the cellar itself, was what to do with the answer once she had it. Because there were only two real possibilities, and she'd known it from the moment she'd lifted that first impossibly heavy bar. Either this belonged to someone, and she was a thief the second she touched it, or it belonged to no one anymore, lost or forgotten or left by the dead, and it could, conceivably, by some impossible mercy, belong to her. She didn't let herself dwell on the second possibility. Hope was a luxury she'd learned to ration, but she couldn't fully kill it, either, and it sat in her chest all afternoon like a coal, putting out a small dangerous warmth, while she dried her clothes in a patch of sun that fell through a high gap in the siding and ate nothing because there was nothing left to eat, and watched the road through the knothole for the green truck that didn't come back. As the light started to go long and golden toward evening, she came to a decision. She would go back down at full dark, when no one could see a light moving in the barn, and she would use her damp matches, and she would find out exactly what she had walked into. And then she would know, one way or the other, whether her life had just ended or just begun. She found things to do while she waited for the dark, because waiting with nothing to do was the worst thing for a mind like hers. She explored the barn properly in the daylight, learning its geography the way she'd learned the layout of every place she'd ever had to survive in, finding the gaps where the drafts came in and the corners where the floor was solid and the places where the boards gave warning creaks underfoot. She studied the front doors from the inside. The bright new chain looped through the handles and padlocked, and she saw that the lock was a good one, expensive, recently oiled, the only well-kept thing in the whole decaying building. Whoever owned this place spent money keeping people out and spent nothing keeping the building up. That told her something, though she couldn't yet say what. She found, in a drawer of the rusted workbench that shrieked when she pulled it open, a half-used candle and a coil of waxed twine and a flat tin of wooden matches that had stayed dry in their drawer, far drier than the soft book of diner matches in her pocket. And best of all, on a shelf above the bench under a drape of cobweb, an old kerosene lantern with maybe an inch of amber fuel still sloshing in its base. The glass chimney intact under a skin of grime so thick it had gone nearly opaque. She took the lantern down and cleaned the chimney with the damp hem of her shirt, working the cloth around inside it until the glass came clear, and she trimmed the blackened wick with the small knife she carried until a clean edge showed. She tested it in the dimmest corner of the barn, shielding the flame with her cupped body so no light would show through the gaps to the road, and she struck one of the dry matches and touched it to the wick, and the flame caught and ran along the trimmed edge and settled into a steady teardrop of yellow light that pushed a warm circle out into the dark. She let it burn for only a few seconds, long enough to be sure of it. And then she licked her fingers and pinched it out to save the fuel, the way her mother had pinched out candles to save them. And a hot thread of grief went through her at the memory, sharp and quick and gone. She had light now. Real light. A flame in a glass that wouldn't die in her hand the way the cheap flashlight had. She held the cool body of the lantern in both hands and felt, absurdly, like she'd been handed a key to a door she hadn't known was locked. She thought a lot about her mother during those hours. She thought about how Linny would have handled this, and she knew the answer, knew it the way she knew her own name. Linny would have been afraid, but she would have been clear-eyed about the fear, and she would have done the right thing, whatever the right thing turned out to be, even if the right thing cost her. Her mother had been the most honest person Della had ever known, honest in a way that had sometimes made their hard life harder, returning the overpaid change, telling the truth when a lie would have been easier and kinder to herself. And Della knew, sitting in that loft with the dead weight of a metal bar in her backpack, that her mother's voice was the one she'd have to answer to in the end, no matter what she did. Whatever was down in that cellar, she was going to have to be the kind of person who could look at her mother's laminated photograph afterward without flinching. Look back without flinching. That was the whole inheritance Linny had left her, and right now it was the only thing she owned that was worth more than a 5-pound bar of gray metal, and she knew it. The dark came down slow and then all at once, the way it does in November. Della watched the last gray light drain out of the gaps in the siding until the barn was black again, and she gave it another full hour after that, counting it out in her head, making sure the road had been empty and silent for a long time before she moved. Then she climbed down from the loft with the lantern and the matches in her backpack, and she cleared the straw and the board off the trapdoor, and she lifted it open into the cold breath of the cellar, and she lit the lantern, the match flaring huge and bright in the dark, the flame settling to a steady glow that pushed the blackness back into the corners. She held the lantern over the open hole and looked down, and now she could see the stone floor at the bottom of the ladder, and the foot of the long shelf, and the faint gleam of the things ranked along it catching the light. She put the lantern's wire handle in her teeth, the heat alarming against her chin, and she went down the ladder one careful rung at a time into the room full of secrets. And at the bottom, she took the lantern in her hand and lifted it high and turned in a slow circle to see, at last, where her bad luck had brought her. What the light showed her stopped her heart. The cellar was a vault. There was no other word for it, and the word arrived in Della's mind fully formed the moment the lantern light spilled out and filled the room. It was longer than the barn was wide, which meant it ran out under the field on one side. A low stone chamber, maybe 40 feet by 20, the walls built of fitted fieldstone laid by hands that had known what they were doing. The ceiling a vault of brick arched overhead like the inside of an old church. The floor was flagstone, swept once, long ago, the dust on it disturbed only by her own footprints from the night before. And it was full. Everywhere the light touched, it touched something that had been placed there with care. The long workbench she had felt in the dark ran the whole length of one wall, and ranked along it in their dozens, in their scores, were the gray metal bars, each one stamped, each one catching the lantern light with a dull soft gleam that was nothing like the flash of silver and everything like the thing she had refused to name. Below the bench, the floor stacks she had felt with her hands rose in neat squared piles to the height of her knee, then higher, pile after pile after pile, more bars than she could count if she stood there all day. And the bars were only the beginning. She moved along the room slowly, holding the lantern high, her breath clouding in the cold, and she made herself look at all of it the way her mother would have wanted her to look, steadily, without flinching, taking the true measure of the thing instead of letting her fear or her hope blur it. The wooden crates against the far wall, the ones she'd thought might be packed with stone, had stenciling on them she could read now, faded black letters in a language she didn't know, German maybe, or something like it, and stamped beneath the letters a symbol that made the back of her neck go cold, an eagle with its wings spread over a wreath, and inside the wreath a shape she'd seen in history books, a shape that meant something terrible, a shape that belonged to the worst chapter of a war, that had ended 50 years before she was born. She stared at it for a long moment. Some of the crate lids had been pried up and reset crookedly, and she lifted one and looked inside and saw, packed in straw gone to dust, more bars, but these were not gray. These were yellow. These had the deep, buttery shine that the gray bars only hinted at, and they were stamped with the same eagle, and there were rows of them in the crate. And there were more crates, a dozen at least, stacked 2 and 3 high against the wall. Now she let herself think the word. Gold. The gray bars were something else, silver maybe, or platinum. She didn't know, but the yellow ones in the crates were unmistakable, and there were so many of them. And the weight of what she was looking at came down on her all at once, and made her sit down hard on an upturned box with the lantern shaking in her hand. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. It took her a while to be able to look again. When she could, she made herself be methodical, because being methodical was the only thing keeping her from coming apart. She got up off the box and went around the whole room with the lantern, slowly, cataloging it the way she'd once helped her mother catalog the contents of the apartment for the people who came to buy it all. This is worth this. That is worth that. Naming things to make them manageable. The flat metal strongboxes she'd felt in the dark were 8 of them. Military gray, locked, far too heavy to be empty, stenciled with numbers that matched. She would later realize. Numbers on the inventory lists, and she did not try to open them. The glass jars on the low ledge, when she held the lantern up behind them, glowed from within, full of cut stones, faceted things that threw the light back in colors, red and white and a deep green that seemed to hold its own small fire. And she did not let herself believe those were what they looked like either, but she counted the jars, 11 of them, sealed with wax around the lids. And she lifted one and tilted it again and listened to the dry shifting slide of a fortune in gemstones, moving against itself in the dark. The rolled canvases standing in the corner, when she eased one open just enough to see, were paintings, old paintings, dark with age and varnish, the kind of thing she'd seen behind velvet ropes on a single school trip to a city museum years ago, a museum where the guard had watched her and the other poor kids the whole time like they might pocket the building. There was a woman's face looking out of one of these rolled canvases with an expression so alive, so present, that Della startled and let it roll closed again, feeling as though she'd opened a door on someone changing. There were leather portfolios tied with faded ribbon that she didn't open, fat with the suggestion of more flat things inside, drawings maybe, or prints, or documents. There were wooden cases stacked beneath the bench that, when she lifted a lid, held rows of coins, gold coins, each in its own little felted slot. The gold so soft and pure it seemed almost to glow against the dark felt. Hundreds to a case and more cases than she counted. The lids stamped with crests and dates from countries that in some cases no longer existed. There was a long flat case lined in tarnished velvet that held what she thought at first were tools, and then understood were table settings, heavy forks and spoons, and serving pieces of worked silver, monogrammed. A family's whole table packed away by someone fleeing, and never reclaimed because there was no one left to reclaim it. Each thing she found was a life. That was the thought that kept rising in her as she went down the room, and she could not push it back down. Each bar, each coin, each painting, each monogrammed spoon had been someone's, had been pried out of someone's hands or someone's home or someone's grave, and packed onto a train, and run into the mountains, and brought across an ocean, and buried under a barn in a town with a dead traffic light. And Della was the first person in 50 years to stand among all of it and feel the weight of what it actually was. And there was, against the back wall, set apart from everything else on a small table by itself, a steel document box, gray, military-looking, with a stenciled number on the lid and a simple latch, not locked. Della stood in front of it for a long time. Everything else in the room was treasure, was weight and shine and value, was the kind of thing that made your hands shake and your breath come short. But the document box was different. It sat alone, deliberately apart, the way you set apart the one thing that matters most among 100 things that only glitter. The box did not gleam. It was the plainest object in the whole vault, and that plainness was itself a kind of signal, as though whoever had placed it there had wanted it to be found by anyone with the sense to understand that the meaning of a thing matters more than its shine. The document box was the only object in the room that might tell her what all the rest of it meant, and she understood, with the strange clarity that the night had given her, that the answer to the question of who all this belonged to, and therefore the answer to the question of what she was allowed to do with any of it, was probably folded up inside it, waiting, the way it had waited a long time already. She set the lantern down on the table next to it, the flames steadying after the jostle, and she wiped her hands on her jeans, an old reflex, the way you clean your hands before you touch something that deserves clean hands. Then she opened the latch, which gave with a small reluctant click, and she lifted the lid. Papers. Folders of them, yellowed and soft, and on top of the folders an oilcloth packet tied with string. She untied it with cold, clumsy fingers and unfolded the oilcloth, and inside was a stack of documents, and on top of the stack was a single sheet of paper, handwritten, in English, in a careful, old-fashioned hand, the ink gone brown with age. She held the lantern close and read it, and as she read it the whole shape of the thing she had fallen into changed, and Della Brennan, 17 years old, alone in a stone vault under an abandoned barn, understood for the first time exactly how much trouble she was in, and exactly how much was at stake, and exactly why a man kept a bright new chain on a falling-down door. The letter was dated more than 30 years before. To whoever finds this, it began, and reading those 4 words made the hair stand up on Della's arms, because it meant the writer had known, had always known, that someday someone would. My name is Augustine Vance, the letter went on, and if you are reading this then I am most likely dead, and the things in this room are no longer mine to keep or to give, and so I will tell you the truth of them, and let your conscience do what mine could not. Della sat down on the edge of the small table, the lantern in her lap, and read on, and the letter told her a story. Augustine Vance had been a young soldier at the end of the war, part of a unit that went into Europe in the last chaotic months when the old order was collapsing and the things that powerful and evil men had stolen were scattered across a ruined continent like seed. His unit had found a train. The letter did not say exactly where, only that it was in a tunnel in the mountains, abandoned, its guards fled or dead, and that the cars of the train were packed with what the letter called the plunder of a continent, the gold and silver and jewels and art and coin that had been taken from the murdered and the dispossessed and the conquered over years of organized theft, gathered up and loaded onto a train and sent into the mountains to be hidden by men who could see their world ending and meant to buy their way into the next one. The army was supposed to secure such finds, the letter said, to inventory them and return them through the proper channels. But the war was ending and the channels were chaos, and the men who guarded the channels were not all honest, and Augustine Vance and 3 others had made a choice in that tunnel that they would spend the rest of their lives paying for. They had taken a portion of it. Not all. They could not have moved all. But a portion, loaded into crates and shipped home through the confusion of a demobilizing army by means the letter described in careful, shamed detail, and brought at last, over years, by one man alone after the other 3 had died or fallen away, to this farm, to this cellar, built for the purpose, where it had sat ever since. I have not spent it, the letter said, and Della read that line twice. In all these years I have not spent a single bar, a single coin, a single stone. I told myself at first that I would, that I had earned it, that the men it was taken from were monsters, and the men it was taken from before that were dead and beyond caring. But I could not. Every time I reached for it, I saw the train, and I knew that this was not treasure. This was grief. This was every life that was emptied to fill those crates, and to spend it would be to spend them, and I found I could not do it and remain a man I could stand to be. So I kept it. I built this room, and I kept it, and I told no one, not my wife, not my son, and the keeping of it has been the great weight of my life, and I am tired, and I am old, and I am writing this so that whoever comes after me will know what I knew, and will perhaps be braver than I was. There is enough here to do a great deal of good. There is also enough here to destroy whoever touches it, because there are people in the world who know this train existed and have spent their lives looking for what came off it, and they are not gentle people, and they do not forgive. If you find this, the letter ended, you have found the hardest choice of your life. I am sorry to leave it to you. I could not make it myself. Augustine Vance. Below the letter, in the folders, was the proof of it, and Della went through it with shaking hands. There were old shipping manifests and army papers. There were lists, page after page in that same careful brown ink, an inventory of everything in the room, every bar by its serial number, every coin, every stone, every painting described, and where it had come from, where Vance had been able to learn it. And there were other papers, newer ones, and these were the ones that made Della's stomach turn over, because they showed her that Augustine Vance had been right about the people who were looking. There were photocopies of newspaper clippings, decades of them, about a missing train and the men who searched for it. And there were letters, threatening letters, in a different hand, demanding to know what Vance knew, accusing him. And the most recent of these was dated only a few years before, which meant the search had not stopped when Vance died, which meant someone still believed, still hunted, still wanted. And clipped to the last letter was a photograph, and Della held the lantern to it, and the photograph was of this farm, taken from the road, and standing in front of the barn with his arms crossed was a heavy-set man in a plaid shirt, and Della had seen that shape before, that very morning, behind the wheel of an old green truck. She sat very still in the cold with the photograph in her hand. The man in the green truck was not the owner of this place in any innocent sense. The man in the green truck was a hunter who had found his way to the right barn, and he was watching it, checking on it, waiting, and the only thing standing between him and the cellar was that he hadn't yet found a way in, hadn't yet been sure enough to break a 30-year-old farmer's locks and dig up his floor. And now there was a torn hasp on a little red door at the back corner. Now there was a way in, and a sign that someone had used it. Della understood that she had, by walking out of a Rainstorm into the first shelter she could find, walked into the exact center of something that men had killed for and would kill for again, and that her time was not measured in days. It was measured in how long it took a watchful man to drive up a track and walk around a building. She made herself move. She put the letter and the photograph and the most important-looking folders into her backpack, wrapping them in the plastic bag that had kept her dry clothes dry, because the papers were the only thing in the room that could prove the truth, and the truth was the only weapon she had. She did not take more of the gold. The one gray bar in the bottom of her bag felt now like a stone tied around her neck, and she almost left it behind, almost set it back on the bench, but something stopped her, some instinct that said you may need to prove this is real to someone, and a thing in the hand proves more than a thing in a story. She kept it. Then she climbed the ladder out of the vault with the lantern, and she lowered the trapdoor, and she covered it again with straw and the fallen board, and she sat down in the dark barn with her back against the old tractor and tried to think while her heart hammered and her mind ran in circles. She thought about Augustine Vance's letter for a long time. There is enough here to do a great deal of good. The line kept coming back to her. She thought about the soup kitchen that only ran on Tuesdays, and the kids she'd met in shelters, and the medicine her mother couldn't afford, and the long gray river of people she'd drifted among for 8 months, the invisible ones, the stored ones, the ones the world looked right through. There was enough in that room to lift 1,000 of them. There was enough in that room to lift her, to give her a life, a real one, with a roof and a door that locked from the inside and a future that didn't have to be survived one morning at a time. The temptation of it was so enormous that it frightened her more than the man in the green truck. She could take the gray bar in her bag and walk to a city and sell it quietly and have more money than her mother had earned in her whole hard life. She could come back with a truck and take what she could carry and disappear. Nobody knew she was here. Nobody knew she existed. She was already a ghost. A ghost could take a great deal and never be caught. But she kept hearing the rest of the letter. This is not treasure. This is grief. And she kept seeing her mother's face in the candlelight, and hearing her mother's voice returning the overpaid change to a cashier who would never have known the difference, telling a small hard truth when a lie would have cost no one anything. Because the cost wasn't to anyone else, the cost was to who you were, and that was the only thing in the world that nobody could take from you unless you handed it over yourself. You can lose everything else, baby, Linny used to say. They can take the house and the car and the money, and they did. But the only way you lose yourself is if you give yourself away, and nobody can make you do that, not ever, no matter how poor you get. It's the one thing that's always yours. Della had thought, at 15, that this was the kind of thing mothers said because they had nothing else to give. She understood now that it had been the most valuable thing her mother owned, and that Linny had spent her whole life keeping it intact through circumstances that would have broken most people into spending it, and that she had passed it to Della whole, unspent, the only inheritance that had survived the cancer and the auctions and the 8 months of cold. Augustine Vance had kept the gold for 30 years, and it had been the great weight of his life, and he had died still carrying it, and he had not been able to make the final choice, and he had left it to a stranger, and the stranger turned out to be a homeless girl who had nothing in the world but a backpack and a laminated photograph, and the one thing her mother had managed to leave her, which was the unbearable, inconvenient, life-saving habit of being honest. Della understood, sitting there in the dark, that the gold was a test, the same test it had been for Vance, the same test it had been for the 4 soldiers in the tunnel at the end of the war when they'd had to decide whether to be men who secured a find or men who took it. It was not a gift. It was a question, the oldest question, the one that doesn't change no matter how many centuries roll over it. And the question was, who are you, when no one is watching and everything is on offer? Vance had failed it slowly, over 30 years, by neither taking nor returning, by simply keeping and suffering. The soldiers had failed it in a tunnel in an afternoon. And now it was Della's, the same question, the same gold, the same impossible weight, handed down through the dark to a girl who'd come in out of the rain. She didn't answer it right away. She wasn't a saint, and she wasn't a fool, and the answer that her mother would have wanted, the answer that Augustine Vance had wanted to be brave enough to give, was an answer that ended with Della handing over the only fortune she would ever touch and walking back out into the cold with nothing. She sat with that for a long time, in the dark, and she let herself want the gold, let herself feel the whole size of the wanting, because pretending you didn't want a thing was its own kind of lie, and she was done with lies. She wanted it. She wanted it so badly her teeth ached, and her empty stomach clenched. She wanted the roof and the locking door and the never being cold again. She wanted to walk into that diner and leave the waitress $100 tip. She wanted to never again see the move-along look on a stranger's face. And underneath the wanting, steady and quiet and not going anywhere, was the thing her mother had built into her, the thing that knew, with a certainty that was almost physical, that she would not be able to live inside a life she had stolen, would not be able to look at the laminated photograph, would not be able to be warm ever again without remembering that she had bought the warmth with everyone whose grief was packed in those crates. The wanting was enormous, but the knowing was bedrock, and the wanting, for all its size, was built on sand, and Della had learned the hard way which one you could stand on when the water came up. But there was a third way, and it came to her slowly as the gray light began to find the gaps in the siding again, a second dawn since she'd come in out of the rain. She did not have to choose between stealing it all and getting nothing. The letter said there was enough to do a great deal of good. The letter said there were channels, proper channels, that returned such things to where they belonged, to the families of the murdered and the dispossessed, the people it had truly been stolen from. If she could get the truth to the right people, the honest people, the ones who returned things instead of taking them, then the grief in those crates could become something else. It could become restitution. It could become a measure of justice for people who had waited 50 years for any. And girls who found such things, who did the right thing, who handed over fortunes, were sometimes, not always, but sometimes, treated kindly by the world in return. There might be a finder's portion. There might be a reward. There might be, at the very least, a story so remarkable that the world could not entirely look through her anymore, could not store her in a waiting room, would have to see her. The girl who found $385 million under a barn and chose to give it back. She didn't know the number yet. She would learn it later. But she knew it was vast, and she knew that doing right by it could not, leave her exactly as poor as she had been, because the world, for all its blindness, did sometimes reward the thing it could not understand. It was a thin hope, and she knew it. But it was an honest one. And it was the only path that let her keep both the truth in herself. And so she chose it, there in the cold barn at the second dawn, and the choosing settled something in her that had been loose and rattling since her mother died. She had a job now that wasn't just making it to morning. She had a thing to protect and a truth to deliver and a wrong to try to set right. And for the first time in 8 months, she was not a leaf in a gutter being blown around by the cold. She was a person with a purpose, and the purpose was bigger than she was, and that, she understood, was exactly what made it worth having. The problem was that purpose didn't change the arithmetic of the man in the green truck. She had the truth in her backpack now, the letter and the papers and the one gray bar, but a homeless 17-year-old walking into a police station with a story about Nazi gold under a barn was going to be laughed out the door or locked up for evaluation. And either way, the man in the green truck would have all the time in the world to get into that cellar and make it all disappear. She needed someone who would believe her. She needed someone with enough standing that their belief would matter, someone honest enough not to simply take it, someone she could reach without a phone or money or a fixed address. It seemed impossible. She sat in the dark and turned it over and over, and slowly, out of the turning, a name surfaced, a thing she'd half noticed 2 days before without knowing she'd need it. When she'd been nursing her $1.20 coffee in the Coverdale diner, stretching it across 2 hours, there'd been a woman in the next booth, older, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, with a stack of folders and a laptop, working through a pot of coffee of her own and making notes. The waitress had called her by name, had said something like more coffee, Miss Halloran, you working on another one of your stories, and the woman had laughed and said something about the Historical Society and a book she was trying to finish about the county. A local historian, a writer, someone who studied the past of this exact place, who would know whether a man named Augustine Vance had really owned a farm here, who would have the standing and the contacts and the credibility that Della completely lacked, and who, being a person who chased true stories for their own sake, might just be curious enough and honest enough to listen to a strange girl with a strange tale and a 30-year-old letter. It wasn't much. It was a name and a diner and a hope. But it was a direction, and Della had learned that a direction, even a faint one, was the difference between surviving and being lost. She waited out the morning in the loft, watching the road, and the green truck did not come, and around midday, she made her decision and acted on it. She could not stay in the barn another night. That much was clear, because every hour she stayed was an hour the man might choose to walk around the building. And if he caught her here, she didn't want to think about what a man who hunted murdered men's gold would do to a witness. She had to get back to town, find the historian, and set the wheels turning, and she had to do it now, while she still could, while the cellar was still secret and the truth was still hers to deliver. She packed her backpack carefully, the precious papers wrapped and padded against the gray bar so they wouldn't tear, and she ate nothing because there was nothing to eat, and she drank the last of the rainwater from the tarp, and she took one long last look around the barn that had saved her life and very possibly ended her old one. For good. Then she slipped out the little red door, pressing it shut behind her as best she could so the torn hasp wasn't obvious to a glance, and she set out across the field, which had drained overnight into a churned brown mess, but was at least walkable now, keeping low along the line of a hedgerow, so she wouldn't be visible from the road. The walk back to town took most of the afternoon. She stayed off the road where she could, cutting across fields and following the hedgerows, partly to avoid being seen, and partly because every car that passed made her heart stop, and twice she heard an engine and threw herself flat in the wet grass until it had gone by, lying with her cheek in the cold mud and her arms wrapped around the backpack, as though it were a child she was shielding with her body. Once it was a green truck, or a truck that might have been green, moving slow, slower than a car has any reason to move on an empty county road, and she lay in the ditch with her face in the muck and her whole body rigid, and counted her own heartbeats, 1, 2, 3, the way her mother had taught her, until long after the engine had faded into nothing. She didn't move for a full minute after she could no longer hear it. Then she got up, mud-caked and shaking, and went on, because going on was the only thing to do, and because the man in the truck, whoever he was a reason to hurry rather than a reason to stop. The light was already going thin and gold, and then gray as she came up on the outskirts of Coverdale, and the cold was coming down again with the dark, that same marrow-deep November cold that had driven her into the barn 2 nights before, and she was filthy and soaked to the knee and starving, and her legs had begun to do the loose, untrustworthy thing they did when she'd gone too long without food. Her purpose, which had felt like bedrock at the second dawn, felt a great deal thinner now, worn down by the miles and the fear and the empty stomach, and a small, ugly voice in her was saying you should have just taken a bar and gone. Nobody would ever have known. You'd be warm tonight. You'd be fed. And she had to keep answering it, keep choosing, because she understood now that the choice she'd made at dawn wasn't a thing you decided once and were done with. It was a thing you had to keep deciding, over and over, every cold mile, every hungry hour, and that was what made it hard, and that was what made it real. She walked into town as the streetlights flickered on, and she made straight for the diner, because the diner was the only place she knew to start, and because she had learned that when you have no thread to follow you go back to the last place you saw one. The waitress recognized her, and the recognition was not warm. Della saw the look, the move-along look, the same look she'd gotten 2 days before, and she understood that to this woman she was just the homeless kid who'd nursed a coffee too long, and that she had about 30 seconds before she was asked to leave. So she spent them. The woman who was in here a couple days ago, she said, fast, before the waitress could speak, the one with the folders and the laptop, you called her Miss Halloran. The historian. I need to find her. It's important. The waitress's eyes narrowed, and Della could see her deciding whether this was a problem, and Della played the only card she had, which was the truth or the edge of it. I found something old, she said. Something historical. From the war. I think Miss Halloran is the only person who'd understand it. And I don't have a phone or anywhere to look her up, and I've got nobody else. Please. The please came out cracked, and maybe it was the crack that did it. The sound of a kid who was genuinely out of options, because the waitress's face changed, just slightly, the hardness shifting towards something more tired and more human. She studied Della for a moment, the long assessing look of someone who's seen a lot of people come through a diner with a lot of stories, and then she sighed and reached under the counter for a pad and wrote something on it and tore off the sheet and slid it across. Margaret Halloran, it said, and an address, and a phone number. She runs the Historical Society out of the old library annex, the waitress said. She's there most evenings. That woman never goes home. It's 4 blocks up on Chestnut. You can't miss it. Brick building with the green door. And then, as Della took the paper like it was made of gold, the waitress did something that Della would remember for a long time, longer than she'd remember almost anything else about that week. She turned to the pass-through and called something to the cook, and a minute later she made up a paper cup of coffee with 3 creams and 3 sugars without asking how Della took it. The way you fix coffee for a kid you've decided needs the calories. And she folded a fresh grilled cheese sandwich into a paper napkin and pushed them both across the counter. On the house, she said gruffly, before Della could say anything at all. You look like you're about to fall over in my doorway, and I don't need the paperwork. Go on. And don't you tell anybody I'm running a charity in here. I've got a reputation to protect. Della took the food and the coffee and the slip of paper, and she said thank you in a voice that wobbled and broke in the middle, and the waitress waved her off with a flap of her hand and turned away to wipe down a counter that was already clean, the way people do when they've done a kindness and don't want to be thanked for it. And Della went out into the gathering dark holding the first warm food she'd had in 2 days against her chest like something precious. And she thought, walking, this is how it happens. The world looks right through you 100 times, 1,000 times, until you start to believe you really are invisible, that you really don't count. And then once, just once, for no reason you earned, somebody sees you. Somebody fixes your coffee the way you'd fix it for someone you loved. And it turns out to be enough. It turns out to be exactly enough to get you to the next thing. She ate the sandwich walking, in small slow bites the way her mother had taught her, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted. The brick building with the green door was exactly where the waitress had said, 4 blocks up on Chestnut, a squat old structure with Historical Society painted on a hand-lettered sign and a single light burning in a downstairs window. Della stood across the street from it for a few minutes, gathering herself, because she knew this was the moment everything turned on, and she knew she would get one chance to be believed, and she knew that everything about her, her filthy clothes, her smell, her stuffed backpack, her exhaustion, screamed, don't believe this person, and she had to find a way to make a stranger look past all of it. She thought about what to say. She thought about the letter. And then she stopped thinking and crossed the street and knocked on the green door, because there was no perfect way to do this, and waiting only made it harder, and she had learned that the only way through a hard thing was through it. Margaret Halloran opened the door herself, and she was exactly as Della remembered, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, a pin behind her ear, the look of a person interrupted in the middle of work. She took in Della in a single sweep, and Della watched her reach the same conclusion everyone reached, and braced to deliver the same gentle dismissal. The soup kitchen is on Tuesday, dear, or the shelter is on 8th Street, and Della spoke first, fast and clear, the words she'd rehearsed across the street. Miss Halloran, my name is Della Brennan, and I'm sorry to bother you, and I know what I look like, but I need 10 minutes of your time, and then I'll leave if you want me to. I found something 2 days ago, something I think you'd understand better than anyone, because it's from the war, and it has to do with a man who used to own a farm near here, a man named Augustine Vance. The name landed. Della saw it land. Margaret Halloran's face, which had been arranging itself into a polite refusal, went still, and her sharp eyes sharpened further, and she looked at Della in a wholly new way, the way you look at someone who has just said something they shouldn't possibly know. You'd better come in, she said. The inside of the Historical Society was one long room crammed with the past, filing cabinets and map drawers and shelves of crumbling ledgers, a big oak table in the center buried under the folders and laptop Della remembered from the diner, walls covered in old photographs of Coverdale when it had been a busier place, faces from 100 years staring out of their frames. It smelled of old paper and dust and the particular mustiness of preserved things, and it was warm, gloriously warm, the heat from a clanking radiator filling the room, and Della had to stop herself from making a sound at the simple animal pleasure of being warm indoors. Margaret Halloran cleared a chair for her and put a kettle on a hot plate in the corner without being asked, and she sat down across the oak table and folded her hands and said, "All right, Della Brennan. Augustine Vance. How does a girl your age, in your circumstances, come to be saying that name to me?" And Della understood that the historian had decided to test her before she would believe her, that the name had bought her a hearing but not yet trust, and that what she said in the next few minutes would decide everything. So she told the truth, all of it, in order, the way it had happened. She told about the rainstorm and the barn and breaking in to get out of the cold, and she watched Margaret Halloran note the breaking in without flinching, a small honest crime explained by a freezing night, and file it. She told about the sound under the floor and the trapdoor and the ladder down into the dark. She told about the bars she couldn't see and the second dawn and the lantern and the vault. And when she got to the vault, she stopped talking and instead reached into her backpack and took out the gray bar wrapped in its sock and unwrapped it and set it on the oak table between them with a heavy clunk that seemed very loud in the quiet room. Margaret Halloran looked at it. She did not pick it up. She got up and went to a drawer and came back with a jeweler's loupe and a small scale and a pair of cotton gloves. And she put on the gloves and lifted the bar and weighed it in her hand the way Della had. And her face changed, and she set it on the scale and read the number and went very still. Then she turned it under the lamp and put the loupe to her eye and studied the stamp for a long time. The eagle, the numbers, the maker's mark, and when she lowered the loupe her hand was not quite steady. And she looked at Della with an expression Della had never had directed at her before in her whole life, an expression of complete and total belief. Then Della took out the letter and the folders, and she laid them on the table, the brown ink, the careful old hand, to whoever finds this, and Margaret Halloran read the letter from Augustine Vance in silence. And when she finished it, she put it down and took off her glasses and pressed her fingers to her eyes for a moment, and when she took her hand away her eyes were wet. "I have spent 11 years," she said quietly, "writing the history of this county, and I have heard the rumors about Augustine Vance my whole life. The strange old soldier who built a vault under his barn and never spent a dime and went a little mad with whatever secret he was keeping, and I never believed there was anything to it. I thought it was just a story we tell about a lonely old man." She looked at the bar, at the letter, at the filthy, exhausted girl across her table. "And then a child walks in out of the rain," she said, "and lays it on my table." She shook her head slowly. "Do you understand what this is, Della? Do you understand what you've found?" Della said she thought she did. She said she thought it was a lot of money, and that it had been stolen from people who'd been murdered, and that it belonged to their families if any could be found and to no one if they couldn't, and that she didn't want to keep it, that she'd thought about keeping it. She wouldn't lie about that, but that she'd decided she couldn't because her mother wouldn't have, and because the letter was right that it wasn't treasure, it was grief. And you couldn't build a life on other people's grief and have it be a life worth living. She said all this plainly, not making herself sound noble, just saying it the way it was, and Margaret Halloran listened to all of it. And at the end she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Your mother." And Della said, "She died last year." And the historian nodded slowly and said, "She raised you well." She said it simply, as a fact, and it was the kindest thing anyone had said to Della in longer than she could remember, and Della had to look down at the table for a moment and breathe. Then the warmth went out of the room, because Della told her the rest. She told her about the bright new chain on the falling down doors. She told her about the green truck that came twice a day and slowed at the head of the track, and the heavy-set man who looked up at the buildings the way a man looks at what he means to own. And then she took out the last thing, the photograph clipped to the most recent threatening letter, the photograph of the farm with the heavy-set man standing in front of the barn with his arms crossed, and she put it on the table and said, "That's him. I saw him this morning. He's been watching the barn, and the letter it was clipped to is from a few years ago, and it's threatening Mr. Vance, asking what he knows, and there's a whole stack of them, going back years, so whoever this is, he's been hunting this for a long time. And now there's a broken door on that barn that wasn't broken before, and I think he's going to find it soon, maybe tomorrow, maybe tonight, and when he does it's all going to disappear, and nobody will ever know it was there." Margaret Halloran picked up the photograph and looked at it, and her face, which had been soft with wonder, went hard and cold, and she said a word under her breath that Della didn't catch. And then she said, "I know this man." Della's heart dropped. "You know him?" she said. The historian nodded grimly, still looking at the photograph as though it had personally insulted her. "His name is Royce Tully," she said, "though I'd bet money that's not the name he was born with and not the only one he uses. He came to the society about 3 years ago. Very friendly. Very generous. Actually, he made a donation, bought us a new microfilm reader we'd been wanting for years, and I was grateful, and that gratitude bought him a great deal of my time and my files." She set the photograph down on the oak table with the careful flatness of someone setting down something they'd like to throw. He presented himself as an amateur historian, a man of means with an interest in the local past, and I believed it, because I wanted to believe it, because people who care about this work are rare, and I am always glad to find one. She gave a short bitter laugh at herself. He asked all about the old farms, the families that had died out, the properties that had reverted to the county for back taxes. I thought he might be a developer scouting cheap land, or one of those metal detector men who turn up looking for Civil War buttons. She tapped the photograph with one finger. But he asked, more than once, very specifically, about local men who'd served in the Second World War, especially men who'd been in Europe at the very end of it, especially men who'd come home and lived quiet and strange and never seemed to want for money, but never seemed to spend any either. She looked up at Della. "I told him about Augustine Vance. God forgive me. I told him the whole story, the rumors and all, because it's local color. It's the kind of thing I put in my books, and I had no earthly reason to think it was anything but a sad old legend about a lonely man." She got up and went to one of the filing cabinets and pulled a drawer and walked her fingers through it and came back with a single sheet of paper, a printout, and laid it on the table. 18 months ago, she said, after the old man died with no will and no living family anyone could find, the Vance property went up at the county tax auction for unpaid back taxes. The house, the barn, the 11 acres. She tapped the printout, which was a record of the sale. It sold to a holding company for a price that raised eyebrows even at the time, far more than that worn-out little farm was worth to anyone who only wanted the land. She looked at Della. "The holding company is registered to Royce Tully. He owns it, Della. The barn, the cellar, the ground it sits on, and by every law on the books, everything inside it." She let that settle. "That is what we are up against, and you need to understand it clearly, because it changes what we can do. This isn't a case of a thief sneaking onto someone's property to steal it. This is a man who spent 3 years and a great deal of money building a perfectly legal claim to a barn he believes is sitting on top of the most valuable lost cache of the war, and who has been patiently, lawfully, waiting for the right moment to tear up that floor without anyone asking questions. The moment he finds that cellar, there will be no crime. There will be no headline. There will be a wealthy man quietly removing his own property from his own barn, and a continent's worth of stolen grief will vanish into a private vault somewhere on the other side of the world, and the families it was taken from, the ones who've spent 50 years and 3 generations wondering, will never know it was within reach. She pressed her lips together. He will have one. Unless. She stopped. She looked at the letter, and the bar, and the filthy, exhausted, mud-caked girl across her table who had walked miles through the cold rather than keep a single ounce of it. Unless we are faster than he is, she said quietly. And we have, I would guess, almost no time at all. Because there's a torn hasp on that barn door tonight that wasn't there a week ago, and a man like Royce Tully checks his property twice a day, and the very next time he walks around that building, he is going to see exactly what you saw, that someone got in, and he is not going to wonder about it idly. He is going to know. And then everything happens very, very fast. They did not sleep that night. Margaret Halloran moved through her cluttered office with a focus that seemed to take 20 years off her, pulling files, making lists, and Della sat at the oak table wrapped in a blanket the historian had produced from somewhere, eating a second sandwich and watching a plan come together for the first time in her life that she was actually inside of instead of merely subject to. The first thing Margaret did was refuse to call the local police, and she explained why before Della could even ask. A find like this, in a town this small, she said, you don't know who's connected to whom. Royce Tully has been here 3 years buying goodwill with donations and dinners. I don't know who he's bought, and I'm not going to bet your safety on a guess. She tapped the steel gray bar still sitting on the table. This goes over the heads of everyone in this county, all the way to the top. There are people whose entire job is exactly this, recovering what was stolen in that war and getting it back to the families. Those are the people we call. And we call them now, tonight, before that man finds his cellar. She knew who to call because of course she did, because she had spent 11 years writing the history of the county, and history is mostly a matter of knowing who to ask and who to trust. She had a colleague, a professor at a university several states away whom she had corresponded with for years over obscure questions of provenance and record, a man who specialized in exactly this, in looted wartime assets and the long, slow, patient work of restitution, and who had spent his career on the unglamorous edge of it, the registries and the archives and the heartbreaking dead ends. At a little past 1 in the morning, Margaret got him on the phone, apologizing for the hour, and then not apologizing at all once she'd said the first 3 sentences, and she talked for 40 minutes in a low, urgent voice while Della dozed and woke and dozed again in the blanket, catching pieces of it, serial numbers read off slowly and carefully, the word Eagle, the word inventory, the word Vance. When she finally hung up, her face was grim and bright at once, lit from within in a way Della had not seen even when she'd first held the bar. He believed me, Margaret said, and she sat down across the oak table as though her legs had gone unreliable. It helped that I could describe the maker's marks exactly, and read him the serial numbers off your bar and off 3 pages of Vance's inventory. Those numbers are not random, Della. Some of them are on registries, international lists of specific objects that have been cataloged as missing since 1945, missing for 80 years, objects that people have spent entire careers looking for. She pressed a hand flat on the table. He stopped me twice to make me repeat numbers. The second time he was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped, and then he said, in a voice I have never heard him use, Margaret, do you understand what you are telling me? She looked at Della. He is calling federal authorities tonight. Not in the morning. Tonight. The real ones, the people with actual jurisdiction over recovered assets and international restitution, the kind of people who do not exist as far as a man like Royce Tully is concerned, because they operate so far above the level he was counting on. She let out a breath. He says they will want to move at first light, because everyone who does this work understands the same terrible thing we understand, that a cache like this, once a private buyer gets near it, can vanish off the face of the earth in a single night and never be seen again. So we have done it. She reached across the table and, awkwardly, because she was not a woman much given to it, took Della's hand. By tomorrow, Child, this stops being your secret and a frightened girl's burden, and becomes a federal recovery operation with the weight of governments behind it. And you, she said, holding the hand, are going to be the witness who made every bit of it possible. The finder. They can take the gold and the silver and the paintings. They're supposed to. That's the whole point. They go home. But that one fact, that you found it and you told the truth, no one is ever going to be able to take that from you. It's yours. It's the one thing in that cellar that was always going to be yours. But tomorrow was hours away, and the night belonged to the fear, and somewhere out on a dark county road a man checked his property twice a day. Della told Margaret about the torn hasp again, made her understand it again, and the historians. Bright grimness flickered. We have to assume he could find it any time, she said. There's nothing we can do about the barn tonight. We can't go out there. It's the most dangerous place in the world for you right now. All we can do is be faster. And so they waited, and the waiting was its own kind of torture, the two of them in the warm, cluttered room full of the past, while the present sat out there in the dark, deciding whether to ruin everything. Della watched the green door and thought about the green truck and could not make herself believe, even now, even with a professor calling federal agents in the dark, that the world was actually going to let her win. The world had never let her win. She kept waiting for the catch. The catch nearly came at dawn. It was just getting light when headlights swept across the front of the Historical Society, slowing, and Della was up and out of the blanket and pressed against the wall beside the window before she'd even decided to move. 8 months of survival making the decision for her. Margaret looked out, and her whole body went rigid. It's him, she breathed. The green truck. He's slowing down. And Della's heart stopped, because it meant he knew. It meant he'd found the door and somehow followed her, somehow tracked her here. And it was over. The catch had come. The world had won after all. The truck idled in the street, exhaust ghosting up white in the cold morning, and the heavy-set shape behind the wheel seemed to be looking at the building, at the single-lit window, and Della could not breathe. Then a second set of headlights turned onto the street behind the truck, and a third, dark sedans, moving with a quiet purpose that was unmistakable even to a girl who'd never seen it before, and the green truck's brake lights flared, and it accelerated hard, and was gone around the corner, and the sedans went after it, and the street was empty again, and Margaret let out a long shaking breath and said, I think those were our people. And I think Mr. Tully just made a very bad decision about where to be this morning. The next days were a blur unlike anything in Della's life, a blur of being believed, which was so foreign to her that it kept catching her off guard. The federal people, when they came, were not what she'd braced for. She had braced for the move-along look, for being treated as a suspect or a problem or a deluded kid, and instead she was treated, carefully and consistently, as the most important person in the room. There was a woman named Agent Reyes who sat with Della for hours and listened to the whole story twice, and never once made her feel small. And there were specialists who handled the gray bar and Vance's letter as though they were holy relics. And there was, on the second day, the trip back out to the farm, which Della made in the back seat of a government car with Margaret beside her, watching the flooded fields go by. The same fields she had crawled across on her belly to avoid a green truck. And now she was being driven, and the difference was so enormous she had to keep blinking. They had already secured the barn. There was tape across the track and unmarked vehicles parked in the field, and people in jackets with letters on the back moving in and out of the little red door, and Della stood at the edge of it all with Agent Reyes, and watched them bring the first crate up out of the cellar into the gray daylight, 2 people carrying it carefully on a board. And she thought about how she had stood alone in that vault with a kerosene lantern and felt the weight of every life packed into the dark, and how now the daylight was getting in, the world was getting in, and the long secret was over. They had set up lights down in the cellar. She could see the glow of them coming up through the open trapdoor, and the brightness made the whole thing look smaller and more ordinary than it had felt at night with one flame, and at the same time more real, because now other people could see it too. Now it was not just a thing that had happened to her alone in the dark that she might have dreamed. They asked her to show them things, and she did, walking them to the trapdoor, describing where she'd found the document box and the rolled canvases and the jars, and the experts who went down into the vault came back up with their faces changed, the way Margaret's face had changed, The way everyone's face changed who understood what they were standing among. They went down skeptical, some of them, professionals braced for disappointment, because most tips and most rumors and most sellers come to nothing. They came up silent. One of them, an older man with a German accent and careful hands, came up the ladder and stood in the field and took off his glasses and wiped his eyes and didn't try to hide that he was doing it. When Agent Reyes asked quietly if he was all right, he said, "I have spent 40 years looking for things that were taken in that war. Most of it is gone, melted, sold, lost, scattered so far it can never be put back. We find a painting here, a coin there. We almost never find a room." He looked back at the barn, at the glow coming up out of the ground. "I did not think I would live to see a room," he said. And then he looked at Della, this 17-year-old girl in donated clothes with mud still under her fingernails who had walked in out of the rain and found the room, and then walked away from it to tell someone the truth. And he said, "You understand what you have done. You understand." It was not a question. And Della said she thought she was beginning to. She had braced herself, on the drive out, for the cellar to be gone, for them to arrive and find the trapdoor open and the vault empty and Royce Tully's people having beaten them to it in the night, because that was how it always went in her experience. The world snatching the good thing away at the last second just to remind you not to hope. But the vault was exactly as she'd left it. Tully had been stopped in town that very morning, a mile from the Historical Society, and whatever he had been driving toward when those dark sedans turned onto the street behind his green truck, he had never reached the farm, and the cellar had sat untouched through that last night, its secret intact by a margin of hours. Della stood in the field and understood how thin the margin had been, how close it had all come to vanishing, and she felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched tight since the first sound under the floorboards. They had been faster. By a matter of hours, by the width of a single torn hasp and one girl's refusal to keep what she could have kept, they had been faster. Royce Tully had been stopped that morning a mile from the Historical Society and had not been heard from directly since, but his shape hung over everything. Agent Reyes explained it carefully, because Della had a right to understand the danger she'd been in. Tully was not the harmless local history buff he'd played in Margaret's office. He was a known figure in a small, ugly world, a broker who specialized in moving looted and stolen art and assets to private buyers who paid enormous sums to own things they could never display, things that had to stay hidden because their very existence was a crime. He had been investigated before, in other countries, under other names, and had always slipped free because the things he dealt in were, by their nature, secret, and you cannot easily prosecute a man for trafficking objects that no one can prove still exist. He had spent 3 years and a fortune building his legal claim to the Vance farm precisely because legality was his shield, because if he could be the lawful owner of the barn when the cellar was found, then the find was simply his property and no crime had occurred at all. What he had not counted on, what no one could have counted on, was a homeless girl breaking through a rotten door in a rainstorm and finding the cellar first, and being the kind of person who carried the truth to a historian instead of carrying a gold bar to a pawnshop. Della had broken his whole patient design with a torn hasp and a confession letter and a refusal to keep what she could have kept. "You did the one thing he could not plan for," Agent Reyes said. "You were honest when no one would have known. That's what undid him, not the law. You." The case against Tully, in the end, did not even need to rest on the cellar, though the cellar would have been more than enough. It rested on the years of threatening letters he had sent to Augustine Vance, which Della had found in the document box and saved and handed over without fully understanding what they were, letters in Tully's own hand demanding to know what the old man knew, letters that grew colder and more pointed across the years, that proved beyond any argument that Tully had hunted this specific cache for a long time, had known precisely what it was, had pursued a dying veteran for it, and had then, when patience and pressure failed, engineered the purchase of the entire farm out from under a dead man with no heirs in order to seize what he believed was buried there. Those letters, set beside what came up out of the cellar and the international registries the objects matched, built a case that even Tully's lawyers and Tully's considerable money could not slip free of, and Tully had slipped free of a great deal before. Agent Reyes told Della, near the end, that this was the first time in a long career that anyone had managed to hold the man, and that the reason was simple. Every other time, the evidence had been the objects themselves, secret things whose very existence could be denied. This time the evidence was paper, the man's own words, in his own hand, kept for 30 years by an old soldier and then by a homeless girl who didn't throw away anything that might prove the truth. It would take more than a year to bring to trial, and there were stretches where Della had to wait and could do nothing, and the waiting was hard in its own way because she had no power over any of it, because the whole machinery of courts and treaties and governments had taken her secret and made it theirs, and she could only watch. But when the trial came, she would testify, and she did, sitting small and straight in a wood-paneled courtroom in a city far from Coverdale, in a plain dress, telling the truth in a clear, steady voice that did not shake even when Tully's lawyers tried to make her shake it, tried to suggest she had stolen, had trespassed, had invented, had schemed. She had trespassed, she said, when they put it to her, and she would not pretend otherwise. She had broken a door to get out of a freezing rain because she had nowhere else to go, and she would do it again. And she had taken one bar, to prove the thing was real to someone who could help, and she had handed that bar and everything else to the people whose job it was to give it back. And if any of that was a crime, then she supposed she was a criminal. But she noticed, she said, looking straight at Tully across the courtroom, that she was not the one on trial for spending 30 years hunting murdered people's gold. There was a silence in the courtroom after that. Royce Tully, who had spent a lifetime in the shadows trafficking the grief of the dead for the pleasure of buyers who would never display what they bought, sat in the light at last, and was named for what he was, and was convicted, and went to prison, and the small ugly world he had moved and lost one of its quietest and most dangerous men. But that was all later. In the gray field that second day, watching the crates rise up out of the ground into the daylight, all Della knew was that the man in the green truck was not going to win, that everything in the cellar was going to go where it belonged, and that she had been the reason, a homeless girl with a torn hasp and a borrowed lantern and a habit of honesty she had not chosen but had been given, and the knowing of it filled some empty, cold place in her that had been empty and cold for a long, long time. The number, when it came, did not come all at once, because a thing like this is not counted in a day. The bars were weighed and assayed, the gray ones turning out to be platinum, which Della had never even thought of, worth more by weight than the gold beside it. The coins were catalogued, and many of them turned out to be rare beyond their metal, worth far more to collectors than their weight in gold. The gemstones in the 11 jars were graded, and the green ones, the ones that had seemed to hold their own fire, were emeralds of a size and quality that made the experts go quiet. And the paintings, the rolled canvases standing in the corner that Della had been afraid to fully unroll. 3 of them turned out to be works that had been listed as lost since the war, by painters whose names even Della knew, painters from the museum she'd been watched in on a school trip, and their value alone ran into figures that didn't feel like money anymore, that felt like a kind of joke the universe was telling. When it was all finally totaled, months later, the recovered cash from the cellar beneath the Vance barn was valued, conservatively, at $385 million. Della heard the number from Agent Reyes over the phone, and she sat down on the floor of the small clean room she was staying in by then, because her legs simply stopped holding her, and she laughed, and then she cried, and then she laughed again, because there was no other sane response to a number like that attached to a thing you had found by breaking into a barn to keep from freezing to death. But the number was never really hers, and she had known that from the second dawn in the cold barn when she'd made her choice. And the truth was that she had never wanted it to be, because she understood by now what it was made of. Most of the cash went where Augustine Vance had wanted it to go, where Della had wanted it to go, into the long, patient work of restitution, which is a gentle word for the slow, heartbreaking labor of finding the rightful heirs of people who were murdered precisely so that no heirs would remain. The objects that could be traced, and to everyone's surprise many of them could, because Vance had kept his careful inventory, and because the looted records of that war had themselves been preserved by people who understood that the paperwork of theft is also the paperwork of return, were sent back to the families they had been stolen from, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the dispossessed, people scattered now across a dozen countries who received 50 years and 3 generations. Late, some small piece of what had been torn from their bloodline before they were ever born. Della read about some of them later, and Margaret Halloran, who corresponded with restitution offices all over the world now, would sometimes call her with a story, and the stories were the thing Della came to treasure more than any number. There was an old woman in Argentina, 91 years old, who had been a small child when her family was driven from their home in Europe and everything they owned was carted away, and who wept on the telephone, Margaret said, for 10 full minutes, unable to speak, when she was told that a particular painting, a small landscape that had hung above the piano in her grandmother's house, a painting she remembered staring at as a little girl while her mother played, had been found in a cellar in America and was coming home to her at last. There was a family in Israel, descendants of a man who had not survived, who received a set of monogrammed silver, their own name worked into the handle of every piece, and who decided together not to keep it locked away, but to give it to a museum, so that the whole story, where it came from, and where it went, and the 50 years it spent in the dark, and the girl who found it and gave it back, would be told to anyone who came to look, forever, so that it could never be forgotten or denied. There was a man in France, a retired schoolteacher, who recovered a single gold coin that had been his great-grandfather's, one coin out of all that wealth, and who wrote a letter to Della, a letter that came to her through 3 sets of officials and that she kept for the rest of her life, in which he said that the coin itself was nothing, that he would have it melted before he sold it, but that what it meant, that someone had been found honest enough to make its return possible, had given his old family something it had not had in 3 generations, which was the feeling that the world was not, after all, only made of the people who had taken everything from them. There were people who could be found, Della came to understand, only because she had not kept what she found, and that arithmetic, that one truth traded for many returns, was the only arithmetic about the whole affair that ever made her genuinely happy. The grief in those crates, the grief she had felt, the crushing weight of alone in the dark with one small flame, did not disappear, because grief like that never fully disappears. But some of it, at last, after half a century in a hole in the ground, was answered, and Della Brennan had been the one who made the answering possible, and she came to understand, slowly, over years, that this was the thing she had actually found in that cellar. Not a fortune, an answer, a way for an old wrong to be, in some small measure, set right. There was, in the end, a reward, because there are laws about such things, and because the families and the foundations and the governments involved understood very well that without Della Brennan none of them would have anything at all, that the entire cash would have vanished into Royce Tully's hidden vault and been lost a second time, this time forever. The finder's portion, when the lawyers and the treaties and the courts had finished with it, came to a sum that Della would never have to think about money again, a sum that was a fraction of the whole, and was still more than her mother had earned in her entire hard-working life many times over. She did not take it all in a lump, and she did not waste it, because she was Linny Brennan's daughter, and Linny had taught her the value of a single dollar across 1,000 cold days. And a girl who has counted out $41 under a freezing awning does not become a fool the moment the number gets large. She let Margaret Halloran help her find people who would manage it honestly. She finished school. She was 17, and then she was 18, and the difference, with a roof over her head and a door that locked from the inside and a future that no longer had to be survived one morning at a time, was the difference between drowning and standing on the shore. The world, which had looked right through her 1,000 times, could not look through her now, and Della found that fame was a strange and uncomfortable coat to wear. There were reporters, for a while, and the story ran everywhere. The homeless girl who found $385 million under a barn and gave it back. And it was the kind of story the world loves because it lets people believe in something for a few days. She did a small number of interviews, and then she stopped, because she found she did not like being a story, did not like the way the cameras wanted her to cry on cue, did not like being asked over and over whether she had ever been tempted to keep it, as though the answer was supposed to be no, as though the honest answer, which was that of course she had been tempted, that she had wanted it so badly her teeth ached, was somehow the wrong answer. The truth, she came to understand, was less comfortable than the story, and the truth was that doing the right thing had not been easy or obvious or pure, that she had wanted to do the wrong thing with everything in her, and that what had made the difference was not that she was good, but that her mother had spent 15 years building something into her that the wanting could not knock down. She said that, once, to an interviewer who seemed actually to be listening. And it was the only interview she was ever fully glad she'd given. She went back to Coverdale. She had a great deal of money now, and the whole world open to her, and she could have gone anywhere, started over anywhere, somewhere warm, somewhere no one had ever seen her nurse a coffee for 2 hours, and she went back to the little town with the dead traffic light, because it was the place where someone had finally seen her, and you do not forget the place where you stopped being invisible. She found the diner first. The waitress was still there, still gruff, still working the counter with the same tired efficiency, and she did not at first recognize the well-dressed young woman who came in out of the cold and sat down at the counter and asked for a coffee and a grilled cheese, because well-dressed young women come and go, and a busy waitress does not study their faces. She set the coffee down without looking up, and Della said, quietly, 3 creams, 3 sugars, the way you fixed it for me. 2 days in November, a year ago. You gave me a grilled cheese and a coffee and the name of a historian, and you told me not to tell anybody you were running a charity in here. The waitress's hand went still on the coffee pot. She looked up, really looked, and Della watched her face do the slow work of recognition, watched it travel back through a year to a freezing night and a half-dead homeless kid she'd fed on impulse and probably never expected to see again and had maybe wondered about once or twice. The way you wonder about people who pass through, whether they made it, whether the small thing you did made any difference at all. And then her hard, tired face came apart, simply came apart, and she put down the pot and came around the end of the counter, and she hugged a customer for the first time in her professional life, hugged Della hard, and said into her shoulder, "You made it. Oh, honey, you made it." Della bought the diner. Not to run it, not to change it, but to own the building and give it free and clear to the waitress, whose name turned out to be Doreen, and to set up the thing she set up, which was a fund attached to the diner, quiet and permanent, so that anyone who came in cold and hungry and out of options would be fed, no questions asked, no forms to fill, no move-along look, on money that would never run dry, for as long as the diner stood. She did not put her name on it. She did not want a plaque. She wanted what she had been given that night, the simple animal mercy of a warm sandwich handed to you by someone who had decided, for no reason you'd earned, to see you instead of through you, because Della knew exactly what that one sandwich had been worth to a girl with $41 3 days gone, and a dead phone, and nowhere on earth to be. It had not been food. It had been the difference between giving up and going on. And she had decided, standing in that diner with Doreen's arms around her, that no one was ever going to have to nurse a $1.20 coffee for 2 hours under a waitress's hardening stare in this town again. That this one small warm room at least would always see the people who came into it. She did more than that, of course, because the finder's portion was large and Della had spent 8 months among the invisible and knew exactly where the help was needed and exactly how the world failed people like her. She did not build a monument with her name on it. She did the quiet, practical things her mother would have done if her mother had ever had $1 to spare, which she never had. She funded the soup kitchen at the church so that it ran 7 days a week instead of only on Tuesdays, because she remembered standing outside it on a Thursday. She paid for a proper shelter to be built, a real one, with beds and locks and dignity, and she made sure the people who ran it understood that the point was to see the people who came in, to look at them and not through them. She set up something for kids aging out of placement, the ones being stored in waiting rooms for trains that never came, so that no one turning 17 would have to walk out a front door with a backpack and nowhere to go the way she had. She did it without fuss and mostly without her name, and she would have gone on doing it invisibly forever if the work hadn't grown too big to hide. She thought about her mother every day, and she talked to her sometimes, out loud, in the small apartment she kept even after she could have afforded a mansion, because a mansion would have been a betrayal of everything Linny had taught her about the difference between what you have and who you are. She kept the laminated photograph on the windowsill where the light came in. She would look at it, the way she had promised herself in the cold barn she would always be able to look at it, without flinching, and she would tell her mother what she'd done with the day, and she never once had to look away. That was the thing she had bought with the choice she'd made at the second dawn, the thing that no number could have bought and no fortune could have replaced. She could look at her mother's face. She had given herself away to no one. The one thing that was always hers, the thing Linny had said they could never take unless you handed it over, Della still had it, whole and unspent. And she understood now that it had been worth more than everything in the cellar, because everything in the cellar was grief. And this was the opposite of grief. This was the proof that her mother's whole hard life had made something that lasted. Margaret Halloran became something like family, the closest thing to it Della had. The historian finished her book about the county, and there was a chapter in it now that no one could have written before, the true story of Augustine Vance, the soldier who could not spend what he could not return and could not return what he could not face, who built a vault under his barn and carried a continent's grief alone for 30 years and died still carrying it, and left it in the dark with a letter for whoever came after, hoping they would be braver than he was. Della made sure that chapter told the truth about Vance, not as a madman or a thief, but as a man who had made one terrible choice in a tunnel as a frightened young soldier and had spent the rest of his life unable to live with it or undo it. A man whose final act, the letter, the confession left for a stranger, had been the bravest thing he could manage and had turned out, in the end, to be enough. Because the letter was what had let Della understand. The letter was what had turned $385 million from a temptation into a responsibility. Augustine Vance had failed the test his whole life, and then, with his last words, he had passed it forward to someone who could finish it, and Della made sure his name was on the museum displays beside her own. The keeper who could not keep and could not let go, who in the end did the one thing that mattered, which was to tell the truth and trust someone else to be brave. She went out to the farm one more time, a year after that first rainstorm, after the cellar had been emptied and the trial was over and Royce Tully was where he belonged. It was November again, but a clear cold day this time. No rain, the fields gone gold and stubbled, and she stood at the head of the dirt track where she had stood once soaked and shaking and done the arithmetic that homelessness teaches you. An empty barn is shelter, an empty barn is out of the wind. The barn still stood, silver gray against the pale sky. The cellar beneath it was empty now, swept clean, its long secret carried up into the daylight and scattered back across the world to the people it belonged to. She walked across the field, the same field, dry and easy underfoot now, and she went in through the little red door, which had a new hasp on it, and she stood in the big empty space where she had once stripped off her wet clothes and wrapped herself in a stinking tarp and cried for her mother and decided to make it to morning. The trapdoor was closed. The light came in through the gaps in the siding the same as it always had. And Della stood there in the place where her whole life had turned, and she felt no fear anymore, only a deep, strange tenderness for the girl she had been, the freezing, desperate girl who had broken in here with nothing, and who had found, in the dark beneath the floor, not just a fortune, but the answer to the only question that ever really mattered. She thought about how close it had all come to going the other way. A different girl, raised by a different mother, or by no one, would have taken the gray bar and walked to a city and sold it and vanished, and might have had a good life or a bad one, but would have built it on grief, on the murdered, on everyone whose lives had filled those crates, and would have had to spend the rest of her days unable to look at her own reflection without something turning away inside her. Or a different girl might have been caught keeping it, might have been the suspect she'd been so afraid of being, might have lost everything for a fortune she never got to spend. The world had set a trap as old as money itself, and it had set it for a girl who had every reason in the world to step into it, every excuse, every justification, cold and hungry and orphaned and forgotten and owed. Surely the world owed her this one thing after taking everything else. And she had not stepped into it. Not because she was better than anyone, but because somewhere in a small, crooked, warm house years ago, a tired woman lighting a candle over a bowl of plain rice had taught her daughter that the only thing you truly own is who you are, and had kept teaching it through every hard year until it was built into her bones. And that teaching had reached forward through cancer and auctions and 8 months of cold and a torn hasp and a kerosene lantern, and had been there, steady and quiet, at the moment Della needed it most, and had held. That was the inheritance, not the money, though the money had done a great deal of good and would go on doing it for the rest of Della's life. The real inheritance was the thing her mother had managed to leave her with empty hands. The thing that had no weight and no shine, and could not be packed in a crate or hidden in a cellar or stolen by a man in a green truck. The thing that had turned out, when everything was counted, to be worth more than $385 million, and every painting, and every emerald, and every bar of platinum in the dark. Linny Brennan had died with nothing, owning nothing, leaving nothing the world could measure. And she had left her daughter the most valuable thing Della would ever possess. And Della had carried it out of the cold and into the light, and spent it on the only thing worth spending it on, which was becoming the kind of person her mother had always known she could be. She stepped back out of the barn into the clear November light, and she did not look back, because there was nothing behind her now but an empty room where a hard thing had ended well, and everything ahead. She had work to do, the quiet practical work of seeing the people the world looked through, the work that would fill the rest of her life, and that she had chosen freely and gladly. The work that was, she understood, simply her mother's life carried forward and given at last the means it had always lacked. The girl who had come in out of the rain with $41 3 days gone was 18 now, and warm and seen and free, and somewhere her mother was, she chose to believe, lighting a candle and watching, and would never once have to look away. Della Brennan walked back across the gold field toward the road, and the cold could not touch her, and she was, for the first time in her whole life, exactly where she was supposed to be. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.